How can a sustainable production of cocoa be ensured, and more important, how can child labor be really fought effectively? This is the Dukascopy TV studio in Geneva. I'm Daniel Schwenger and I'm joined by Nick Weatherill. He's Executive Director of the International Cocoa Initiative here in Geneva. Welcome, Nick.
Thanks, Daniel.
So the Ivory Coast and Ghana are the chocolate industry's main producers, and they agreed to reduce child labor by 70% until 2020. But now a new study found that actually the number of children in child labor has risen up to 2.1 million childs. So what was your reaction to these results?
Well, obviously 2.1 million kids working in child labour is a big number, and it's a grave cause of concern. It's a stark reminder of the scale of the challenge when you're trying to deal with child labour in agricultural supply chains in Africa. Our initial reaction, because obviously the absolute numbers increased, our initial reaction was obviously some consternation. And we had to dig really quite a lot into the report to better understand what was causing this rise.
What was causing it?
Well, so I mean, importantly, when we interrogated the report and the data within the report, in spite of that big headline figure, which is, you know, the main issue, 2.1 kids working when they should be in school, working in hazardous conditions, etc. There's no denying that that's not acceptable for anyone, for an industry, for a government, or what have you. But digging into the report, there are actually nevertheless some signs, real signs of progress from the work that collectively has been done over the last 10 years, I would say. So the report shows that there are 650,000 children living in cocoa growing areas who are now enrolled in school when they weren't 3 years earlier in the first baseline survey. So that's 650,000 more kids in school. That's positive. Secondly, the report shows that in spite of the increase in the number of child labourers, the severity of child labour, in other words, the tasks that kids are undertaking and the number of times they're doing multiple hazardous tasks, that's on the decline. So the severity of child labour within this context is also moving in the right direction. Third, the frequency of child labour is also appearing to go downwards, moving in the right direction. Kids that were working multiple times through the year are now working less often in those conditions that are not acceptable. So breaking the numbers open, we see some progress. But again, you know, 2.1 million kids, that's a huge number of kids. It's 2.1 million reasons to continue and accelerate the work that we do, if you like. Now, you ask what's behind the increase, because on one side we see progress in the numbers, and what's very clear is that over the 5 years between the baseline survey that was done in 2008-09 and this last survey, which was conducted in 2013-14, there's actually been a massive increase in the number of households who are growing cocoa. So there are now 80%, there's been an 80% increase in the number of households farming cocoa. And with that increase in the number of households farming cocoa, there's been a 40% increase in the production of cocoa, the amount of tons of cocoa that's been produced over that period of time. So relative to those numbers, the 21% increase in child labour, in the number of child labourers, is a slower increase than the increase in production and the increase in farming population. And the main cause behind this is demographics and production of cocoa.
So, but the real goal is to really have a sustainable cocoa production after all.
Yes.
So actually, what does the ICI do to really ensure this sustainable production in future?
So, I mean, we have a model of working with farming community, cocoa farming communities where we address very holistically the causes of child labour. So we tackle the issue of awareness, because often there's not sufficient awareness about the kind of tasks that are considered to be hazardous and that are actually outlawed by international conventions and so forth. We tackle the very important poverty driver. You know, often farmers, cocoa farmers, are poor. These are poor countries. Large majority of the rural population in these countries lives below the poverty line. And so if you're poor, you cannot necessarily afford school fees, and your child becomes a resource that helps you increase your household income. So if we find other means to have cocoa farming households increase their income, whether through boosting the production, the yields of cocoa that they grow, or undertaking other livelihood activities, increasing the income to the household means that we've got a greater chance of children in that household not working and being sent to school, for instance. And the other dimensions that we work on are around schooling. You know, you have to create alternatives for kids. You can't ask farmers not to take their children onto the farm if there's no school for them to go to as an alternative. So a big amount of our work is about building school infrastructure, improving access to school for kids who are from poor and vulnerable households.
And you work a lot with governments. Is it prosecuted enough if children are, for example, not going to school? Or
well, it's a lot. You know, this is a journey. I mean, ultimately, if we move to prosecuting, the majority of these children, just to be very clear, the majority of them are working on their family farms. Okay, and if we move too far towards the idea of prosecuting farmers for having their kids help out on the family farm, when there isn't an alternative for those kids, and if the government hasn't been able up until now to provide the schooling infrastructure for them, for instance, then, to be honest, all we will do is we will drive the problem underground. Yeah, so we take a different approach. We don't think that prosecution of farmers is the way forward. It's about creating alternatives for the farmers, building awareness, improving their income so that they can afford the alternatives that are available to them. And then I think putting in place mechanisms in the supply chain that can monitor the extent to which children are or are not being used, and that can identify child labour when it happens, and then can direct resources to individual cases of child labour to assist them and their households in finding that alternative.
So actually, what can the industry do? What role does it have? There is a lot of also criticism that initiatives like yours are not sufficiently funded, for example. So how do you see the role of the industry? Well,
I think this is a very good point, because ultimately, you know, if we come back to this situation we were describing, where you have a report that shows you've got 2.1 million kids in child labour, but at the same time it also shows that you're making progress, then the logical conclusion to that is that we have a solution. We know what the solution looks like, but the scale at which we're applying that solution is insufficient against the scale of the problem. And this is absolutely true. I mean, our work in cocoa growing communities, the work we do with cocoa farming communities and their households on preventing child labour, we estimate has covered to date about 10% of the cocoa growing communities in Ivory Coast and Ghana. So even if you have a big impact in 10% of the communities, let's say you reduce child labour, as we've seen we can, by 40% in those communities where we work. If it's only 10% of the communities, then at national level that only represents a 4% decrease in child labour across the board. So the real challenge now is to move to a different scale of intervention, a different scale of implementation, so that rather than dealing with 10% of the population, of the cocoa growing population, we move, we hope, at least to 30% of the population. over the next 5 years. You can't go from 10% to 100% overnight. This is going to be incremental, and it's going to be a long haul. But as I said, we know what works. We know that certain solutions have an impact. We've seen in our communities reductions in child labour, big increases in children attending school, and now what we're looking for is the opportunity to take those solutions to a bigger scale.
What is planned next at the ICI?
So I think the next 5 years are going to be very busy. We have a 2020 target to improve child protection for 1 million kids living in approximately 20% more cocoa growing communities. You asked me earlier what the industry role and responsibility in all of this is, and I think it's very, very important to note that the chocolate and cocoa industry, sizing up the scale of the sustainability challenge that they face, and really driven by the business case as well as the value case, knowing that their business depends on making cocoa production sustainable, on making cocoa farming a more dignified lifestyle and livelihood. They've recently made a big commitment. It's called Cocoa Action. It's 11 of the biggest chocolate and cocoa companies have agreed to align their strategies, to work together in much greater coordination to implement projects at a greater scale. Their target for the next phase of this over the next 5 years is to assist 300,000 farmers with a better production, better agricultural inputs to support boosted cocoa yields, but also very importantly to support those farmers in their communities with a sort of a social package of support, so that a lot of the drivers of child labour that we talk about, the lack of schools, for instance, poor access to education, these things are also tackled. So this Cocoa Action Initiative, which I think is valued at approximately $400 million, there's a big chunk of that foreseen for stepping up the work on child labour prevention and response. ICI will be very central to the collective industry's implementation of those plans. Currently, we're ensuring that the good practices that we've learned and acquired in our projects are applied within that scaled up effort of the industry. So each of those companies who are also members of ICI will be taking the good practices, the innovations, some of the research findings, and channeling those into an improved and scaled up sustainability strategy. And each of those companies' sustainability strategy will look more like the other companies. There'll be greater alignment, greater coordination, and therefore greater efficiency and greater impact.
Thank you very much, Nick Weatherill, for being here today, and we would look forward to having you back in here in the studio to track on what has been going on, fighting child labour and ensuring sustainable cocoa production.
Thanks, Daniel. I look forward to that.
And thanks for watching. Do make sure to keep clicking back on the Dukascopy TV website for latest updates and exclusive interviews like this. Have a great day and see you next time.